Well, good afternoon, everyone, again, and thank you very much for staying with us today during our triptych, our three elements of our symposium today on the themes of media, mission, and education. And now we come to our third and final part of this triptych on education. We're delighted to be joined today by Father Damien Howard. Damien is the provincial of the Jesuits in Britain, which means he's in charge of the Jesuits in Britain, essentially. And over the course of 30 years as a religious, he's worked in diverse Jesuit institutions, parishes, schools, social centres, retreat houses, and most recently in the role of university lecturer in interreligious relations. And Damien has a particular interest in and specialisation in Islam. Responding to Damien is Lynn Bourne. Lynn is a colleague head teacher. She's taught in 4 secondary schools in Devon, serving on the senior leadership team in 3 of them before being appointed head of St Anne's Catholic School and Sixth Form in Southampton. Lynn has a relentless focus on the quality of teaching and learning, and she led the school to achieve an outstanding Ofsted, placing her school in the top 1% nationally for progress, and similarly, an equally outstanding result for the Catholic life of the school, which is a great passion for her as a head of a Catholic school. Currently, as executive head teacher, supporting multiple Catholic secondary schools, Lynn also chairs the Portsmouth Diocesan Education Stewardship Group, as well as the Diocesan Secondary Head Teachers for the Diocese of Portsmouth. So, it's a great pleasure to welcome Damien Howard.
Well, a big thank you for inviting me to this fantastic event to talk about communication in the educational context, a subject that's very dear to my heart indeed, and to do so as we remember the papal visit of 2010. That visit was a moment of conversion for public discourse in this country, conversion, I would say, to reality. Britain had been primed for an encounter with a diabolical figure, a Nazi, a child abuse facilitator, the arch-conservative Panzer Cardinal. And then along he came, a gentle, humble and shy man who took us all to Hyde Park and showed us how to gaze upon God, giving a masterclass in educational communication, which succeeded less by virtue of what was said than by how it was said. With that in mind, I want to talk to you today less about what we say in evangelizing than about how we say it, and particularly how we need to start by putting in place a key condition for the work of evangelization that I want to call reconciliation with reality. For even the most carefully honed message, if it's planted on the foundations of unreality, as it were, may end up doing more damage than good. Let me start, if I may, with 2 introductory points. The first is to introduce you to a figure who haunts us on our sense of what education is all about. And this is where I find, I'm not quite sure how to get the next page up. Ah, there it is, I think, try that. There we are. This is a painting in the National Gallery in the centre of London, and it's called Philosophy. And it's by the 17th century Italian Baroque painter Salvator Rosa. It's a self-portrait. Rosa's raffish self-presentation reminds me of that shift that took place a few years back when academics suddenly realized that they too could be objects of beauty. This is an aspirational image. Rosa was not in fact a philosopher, but he rather fancies himself as one. He aspires to produce art that is both beautiful and intellectually respectable. It's also a romantic portrayal of the intellectual, pre-romantic, I think we ought to say, given the date of composition, which is a few years before the death of Descartes. Rosa wants you to know that philosophy is cool. The figure is young, dashingly attired, and of course male. The romantic figure par excellence is that of the hero, and this is a heroic image. We see a defiant individual half hidden in shadow. He's his own man, forbidding too. I don't know if you'd want to engage him in conversation about ethics or the scientific method, but I don't think I would. I'd expect rapier wit and acerbic put down rather than an indulgent willingness to engage in philosophical speculation. And in case there's any doubt at all, Rosa has helpfully appended a little placard which says, "Unless what you have to say is better than silence, don't speak." What, one wonders, is it that makes an utterance more valuable than silence? Its truth, perhaps? Or perhaps more likely, its brilliance, its spellbinding originality, its shock value even. There's something too about the way he has us fixed in his gaze, which lends a truly iconic quality to this image, in the real religious sense of that word. My second introductory point is about reality and its relationship to the educational system. Because before I explore our profound contemporary crisis of the real, we must admit that universities and schools have always had a complex relationship with reality. They distance their students from crucial aspects of it, being places in which the virtues of learning are to be inculcated, a process that requires freedom from distraction. They've often sought to keep their students free from the demands of manual work or the marketplace. They've often deployed a certain theatricality too, which has a masking effect on reality. If you read the Ratio Studiorum of the Young Society of Jesus, you'd be struck by how the document is a series of character portraits, treating in detail the virtues and activities of each character in the life of the college. It is in effect a presentation of the dramatis personae, which sets the stage for the action of the educational process. I didn't have the benefit of a Jesuit education, alas, still less one governed by the Ratio Studiorum, but the theatricality of the school I did attend made itself felt in all sorts of set-piece ceremonies and daily rituals, including the disciplinary performances of members of staff. It created the sense of a world. And when that was shown to be an illusion, trauma ensued, as when one encountered a teacher out of context, walking her dog in the park, for instance. The curriculum and the exam system themselves have the effect of consolidating an artificial world by establishing a sense of the canonical, the official body of knowledge. Teaching to the exam does particular damage to a sense of reality, as does an overemphasis on the abstract practice of grading. In all my years of schooling, I still recall with a certain exhilaration one supply teacher who came to teach us English for a week. He disturbed us by his wild roaming from the subject and across the disciplines. For those of us at a young, tender age, it was astonishing to witness the explosion of the lie that an English teacher could only really comment on poems and grammar. That day he punctuated for me the cocoon of unreality which the classroom had taken such pains to fabricate. There's one further intrusion of unreality into the schoolroom which I want us to think about now as we enter the main argument that I want to put to you. It's depicted in Alan Bennett's play, The History Boys, an account of the goings-on in a Yorkshire school among a group of Oxbridge candidates, who would, as it happens, have been almost exact contemporaries of mine. The play contains considerable ambiguities, let's just say that, but I want to concentrate on one of its central conceits, which is the dramatization of the standoff between two pedagogical styles. The first is that of Hector, the play's anti-hero. Hector's approach to education is not easy to describe. Spontaneous, an engagement with culture high and low, based on an unpretentious humanism, all the more humane for being his own unique confection. His teaching embodies a freedom from the curriculum which would scarcely be tolerated today, and which was designed to help students learn how to learn. Hector's program is disrupted by the arrival of Erwin, an inexperienced teacher whose one concern is that the pupils should get into Oxbridge by voicing opinions that are original, brilliantly counterintuitive, even shocking, be they about the Holocaust or the Carry On movies. Perhaps you could sum up his style as being less interested in learning than in appearing learned. The notion that what counts is brilliance and originality rather than being true to life is something I recognize as having appeared on the horizon of my own educational experience. But it predates the 1970s, because Alan Bennett is plainly saying something about his own experience of education in the 1950s. I suspect it has something to do with a political culture in Britain that's losing control and no longer really feels able to understand how the world actually works. Be that as it may, the quest for the counterintuitive, the subversive, remains ensconced in the ethos of the academy today. It's something of a cliche to rail against the way critical theory and other forms of left-wing ideology dominate the culture of academia in the English-speaking world. But there's a parallel on the right too, with revisionism, various forms of resistance to political correctness, and even counterfactual history, all springing up on the same fertile ground. Well, if already in the latter half of the last century, a new penchant for unreality was beginning to make itself felt, the advent of cyberspace has intensified that movement. This was particularly striking at the turn of the century, just as the internet was coming into its own, and the West found itself plunged, and before the West found itself plunged into all the disturbances of the post-9/11 world, with the proliferation of untruth, gross acts of political deception, and the willful misrepresentation of reality by political elites. Just on the eve of all those developments, during the last 2 years of the 20th century, a series of films came out of Hollywood, which in very different ways expressed the same philosophical viewpoint by bringing the nature of reality itself into question. In American Beauty, the now disgraced Kevin Spacey showed us the banality of American suburban life and his attempt to overcome it by adolescent rebellion, transgressive drugs, and relationships. In Fight Club, we were given an insight into the supposedly emasculating effects of contemporary consumerism and the redemptive role of masculine violence. The Truman Show portrayed an individual unaware of being the sole star of a long-running TV reality show, finally escaping his phony world, though with trauma we never see. And then a film which more than any other powerfully encapsulates the imperative of being thoroughly suspicious of reality as it presents itself. Of course, The Matrix. I don't think any movie has made as much impact on the culture of whole generations than this one. It sets out a world in which the minds of human beings have been entrapped by intelligent machines in an artificially generated world, the Matrix, so as to disguise the fact that their living bodies are actually being used as an energy source by complex machines. A small elite group have managed to escape the Matrix and to launch a counterinsurgency. It's a philosophically crafted film which has enthralled several generations of science fiction fans, offering a potent metaphor for our cultural predicament in the internet era. All these movies make more or less the same point. Ordinary everyday life is sham, but that there's a salvation to be had by seeing through it and getting beyond it, through transgression, violence, or the agency of a savior figure who exposes the lie. But it's the Matrix which has given cyberculture the most telling soteriological metaphor of all, the red pill. It comes in a famous scene in which Keanu Reeves is presented with a choice between two pills. If he takes the blue pill, he'll carry on forever in the world of illusion, comfortable but ignorant. If he takes the red pill, it's down the rabbit hole, into the desperately hard truth of the actual predicament in which human beings find themselves. Taking the red pill will mean a hard initiation into a brutal world of conflict and violence, in which salvation is a possibility, though not one to be taken for granted. The term red pilling is now cyber slang. It refers to the transformation of one's consciousness, which is known in other contexts as radicalization. What happens when you realize that everything you thought was real or true is in fact the opposite, and vice versa. The metaphor has been applied to a whole host of contemporary examples: conversion to jihadi Islamism in a Muslim context, misogynistic incel extremism, white supremacism, anti-globalization activism, and of course any of a multitude of conspiracy theories, such as the QAnon movement in the United States, which is beginning to show signs itself of becoming a pseudo-religious movement, with a soteriology centered on Donald Trump. We're seeing, in short, an extremely significant crisis of the real that has emerged in recent history, and with tremendous force. And just to be clear, the crisis consists not so much in the fragility of our hold on reality, as in the fact that we have an intense and shared awareness of that fact. Put simply, our daily experience seems increasingly unreal to us. There are contingent factors at work which exacerbate the situation. We talked a lot this morning about the problems that social media brings. You could talk about the role of Russian or Chinese cyber interference in our politics and a whole host of other exacerbating factors. But they aren't the deep causes of this crisis of the real. What is? Why is it that we're finding it so hard even to believe that there is such a thing as truth or reality out there? This is where a bit of philosophy isn't just cool, but actually comes in useful. Let me turn to an essay entitled After Realism, in a book written back right at the end of the last century by a British Catholic intellectual, Nicholas Boyle. His topic is literary style, so a little bit similar to our own question about communication in education. Boyle points out that much of the literature of the 20th century is written in a style that is distinctly non-realist. Unlike so much of the literature of previous centuries, it doesn't present the world as it is, or even try to create the impression of being mimetic. Rather, it presents a highly conceptualized or even fantastical world, which no reader could possibly mistake for daily life as we know it. Think of the novels of Salman Rushdie or Umberto Eco. Whether through the use of magical realism or a self-consciously conceptual approach, neither of these authors has the least interest in relating a story about how the world actually is. Compare them with Shakespeare or Dickens, and you realize that something very particular is going on in the 20th century, which mirrors the post-realism of our public and media life today. What is it that's behind the ubiquity of this non-realist style? Boyle traces it all back to Nietzsche and his understanding of the relationship between words and reality. Most of us think, don't we, that words relate to reality in some way. They refer. If you want to know something about the actual order of things, examine the way you talk about them, and that will give you a more or less reliable map of the real. Realist philosophers talk of a correspondence theory of truth, the idea that a statement is true if the words in a statement correspond to the actual state of affairs out there. Well, Nietzsche just doesn't think that words actually refer to things at all. He was struck by the metaphorical nature of so much language, the way that words take on new meanings, only loosely related to the ones they used to have. Language, it turns out for him, isn't a map of reality out there. It's something turned in on itself, a constantly shifting landscape of discourse, telling us nothing about an external, objectively existing reality, but only about the will to power that generates the discourse. Nietzsche says, in the most subversive way possible, truths are illusions whose illusory nature has been forgotten. The point of using that word illusion is that not only does language not refer to objective reality, but that we know it doesn't now, because we have been disillusioned, radicalized, if you like. Other people still languish under the illusion of realism, but for the enlightened few, a new way of living is now possible, and much of Nietzsche's work is all about showing what that new life might be. Boyle points out that Nietzsche's self-conscious anti-realism gives rise to a style of writing which he calls the middle mode, hovering somewhere between philosophical abstraction and poetic specificity. Nietzsche will take, for instance, a figure from ancient mythology, Zarathustra or Apollo, say, and construct his own discourse around it, using the myth in a loose way to illuminate this or that aspect of whatever it is that he's interested in, though largely unconstrained by any external control, with the result that what he writes doesn't even pretend to represent anything other than his own subjective preoccupations. Typically, people either react against this sort of discourse because it comes across as a rant, or they're seduced by its extraordinary suggestiveness, by the depths to which it alludes, or the transgressive thought that it births. Boyle rightly sees the ubiquity in modern literature of this kind of discourse as seriously problematic. A way of talking that seeks to liberate itself from the constraints of reality, that refuses to be limited by the contours of the real, might also be called ideological, closed, or self-referential. If it can't be challenged by reality, nor will it be corrected by an interlocutor. Ask a question, and the answer will come back without pause for breath, because the point of the discourse is geared totally to assertiveness, not to receptivity. The discourse is unchallengeable. It's monologue, not dialogue. Pope Francis has much to say about closed systems of thought. I don't know if he thinks of it in quite the same way that Nicholas Boyle does, but he particularly doesn't like Jesuits who think in ways that are divorced from reality, thinking that they've got all the answers. The Jesuit, he says, must be a person whose thought is incomplete, in the sense of open-ended thinking. There's a hint in what Pope Francis is telling Jesuits there of a way back to reality by being prepared to think and speak in an incomplete and open-ended way. I don't have all the answers. But we need to go a little further with Boyle's diagnosis of the middle mode, this self-consciously anti-real way of communicating, because it has some other extremely interesting ramifications. And three strike me as particularly important, and they're related to the question of gender, image, and death. We're all aware these days that the relationship between sex and gender on the one hand, and the words we use to talk about them, is a neuralgic one. Nietzsche takes aim at the view that there's any essential difference between male and female. That position is compatible with the view that humanity is essentially androgynous, or that male and female are arbitrary social constructs, a familiar notion propounded by gender theorists today. But Boyle points out that that's not actually what Nietzsche thinks himself. For Nietzsche, the negation of the essential difference between male and female is in favor of an ultimate affirmation of the male. Women are just incomplete, negated men. Well, for those of us who've long suspected that men have been the ultimate beneficiaries of the sexual revolution, that a major effect of the last 50 years of social, moral, and cultural turbulence has been the negation of woman rather than her systematic emancipation, Nietzsche is, I think, an important witness. We Catholics may have our own challenges in this area, but our anthropology gives us a critical perspective on all the options available currently in our culture when it comes to the issues of sex and gender. In particular, we're highly suspicious of that vision, which sees the highest human good as being self-actualization. And we're not at all surprised when it leads people on the left, for instance, to advocate pornography as a means of female emancipation, or on the right to advocate the lifestyle of the so-called trad wife, the modern young woman who, for ideological reasons, embraces an almost caricatural submissiveness to her husband. The keen reader of Nietzsche might have predicted both of those. Boyle links this analysis of gender relations to his encounter of Nietzsche's literary style. Using Derrida's observation that the middle mode is a rapier-like discourse, resembling a stylus cutting through, penetrating a veil-like membrane of whatever it is that's under an attack. A chilling quotation from Zarathustra gives the clue to what's going on. Nietzsche says this: for there to be art, one physiological precondition is indispensable, the ecstasy of the will, of an overcharged and swollen will. Out of this feeling, one emits into things, one forces things to take from us, one rapes them. This process is named idealization. Man, in this condition, transforms things until they mirror his power. A very uncomfortable quotation to read, I have to say. The literary style of a self-consciously unmitigated masculinity is a brutal and violent thing, put like that. It's pure self-assertion. It doesn't dialogue or seek to embrace the other. It certainly doesn't listen. But it also creates its own impenetrable discourse, fending off critique with acerbic put-downs. If you spend any time on social media, you'll be struck by the abundance of terms now used to celebrate the act of closing down discussion. Shutting down, slamming down, taking on, owning, destroying, mocking, deriding, dismantling, cancelling. The list goes on. It tells us something about what happens to public discourse when there's a tacit consensus that words don't refer anymore. To use another telling neologism of the age, words get weaponized. That quotation speaks of idealization, and it names the process by which Nietzsche relates the issues which concern him to some person, usually from mythology, but sometimes, like Wagner, someone from real life. This process of idealization involves what Boyle calls the transformation of reality into image. Again, a process which is visible all around us in the culture in which we live. Boyle brings in Roland Barthes' book on photography to say something about the preponderance of image in our culture. And what he was writing in the 1980s is even more obviously true in the age of Instagram. He says this: we live in the generalization of the imaginary. Look at the USA. Everything there is transformed into images. Only images exist. Only images are produced. Only images are consumed. When generalized, the image derealizes the human world of conflicts and desires under the pretense of illustrating it. The way we feast on images takes us above the play of conflict and desire, which is our real world. The world is transformed into myriad shifting images of no depth. We surf TV channels or the web or the social media platform, hurtling within a split second from endearing videos of animals doing the sorts of intelligent things that we've always been told they can't, to scenes of the most appalling atrocities taking place in far-off parts of the world. When Barthes says that this imagization of reality denies us the conflict of the world, he doesn't mean that conflict is absent, far from it, just that we as sovereign surfers, as it were, stand above the fray. And that even though it appears to broaden our knowledge and horizons, in some subtle way, it actually distances ourselves from reality. And a final feature of Nietzsche's middle mode is its incapacity to say anything about death. It's a self-referential discourse with no end. There's no author, no reader, and the figures who inhabit the discourse are only ciphers. They don't appear to be characters of flesh and blood. Therefore, they cannot die, and even if they did, their death wouldn't signify, wouldn't be something we would need or want to mourn. Boyle gives a counterexample to that sort of failure to reference mortality by going back to Barthes' writing about photography. He makes the point that the essence of photography as a form of communication is a kind of pathos, an ineluctable referentiality with regard to what was happening in the world at that moment, in that place and time, to this person, in this street, etc. That specificity which is now gone forever and thus expresses a kind of mortality. In the modern era, one good question we could ask ourselves is, might photography be seen as an antidote now to the middle mode of discourse, which denies all of these things? Well, think for just one moment and you realize that with the advent of CGI and AI and the total manipulability of digital imagery, that seems like a very fond kind of nostalgia indeed. In a culture in which the dominance of the image has massively contributed to our diluted sense of reality, we've now weakened one of the few ways in which imagery itself still signifies in a way that gives us a real hold on reality. Deathlessness, the erasure of finitude and specificity, the evacuation of our sense that all our talk touches a world out there. All of this is encroaching ever more profoundly on the way we communicate. So what's the challenge we face as a church in this extremely difficult predicament? It would be nice, wouldn't it, to say we could somehow extract ourselves entirely from the situation our civilization faces by embracing some kind of naive realism. And plenty of people are trying to do precisely that. But the power of Nietzsche's analysis lies paradoxically in the fact that he articulates a really important truth about the way we encounter the real. And we cannot just think, or talk our way out of that. And yet, Christians are still committed to a view of reality that is both independent of and yet intelligible to us. We come at it through lenses and filters of language and culture, of course, and that makes reality hard to know. But some kind of critical realism commends itself, and it seems to me that the crucial ramification of that means that we're entitled to, indeed duty-bound, to communicate, especially in our educational institutions, a genuine sense of the real. What that means is made clear in this extended passage from Nicholas Boyle's essay. I'll just read it because I think every word is very precious here. We must look to an educational idiom that will mediate one to another all three aspects of our experience: the universal condition of our work, which is to say our involvement in the global economy, our specific identity as representatives of a particular place and time, and our individuality as a born, sexed, and mortal body. Each, in turn and together, would have to be grasped and shown to be ultimate as the truth. Instead, for the writer in the middle mode, there's all too often only one truth, his or her omnipotence, as the author who can play at will with the material of imagination, who transforms things until they mirror his power, who can reshuffle time and place and all specific things into new patterns of metaphor, just as the market repackages them as priced commodities. And that's the nub of the issue. It's about taking on the dominant anthropology of our culture, which insists that in the final analysis, that to be human is to be a consumer. Boyle sketches his programs in those few words, and I think a good case could be made for saying that his vision corresponds well to much of what is already going on in our Catholic schools. In the light of that insight, I want to end this presentation with a rapid tour of the horizon to survey the idioms of educational communication in our current cultural milieu, and to ask the question of how we might position ourselves in voicing a postmodern Christian realism. So let's look at just 4 communicative idioms currently at work in our world. The first is a slightly controversial one, Jordan Peterson, Canadian intellectual and polemicist. He evokes Salvatore Rosa's romantic hero with his rapier-like tone, the cut and thrust of this unabashed cultural warrior and his specific attention to the crisis of masculinity in a world he sees dominated by militant feminism. All of these features alert me to the possible presence of the middle mode of discourse at work. I suspect that the Marxism which he sees at work everywhere is an idealization in the Nietzschean sense, a straw man which can helpfully be invoked to distract from a rather more complex and subtle reality. And his ideological loyalties are quite hard to pin down, a fact that also suggests that his principal agenda may not be to elucidate so much as to obfuscate. I know that he's the object of admiration for a number of Catholic commentators, and I'm sure they've got very good reasons for having that admiration, but I'm not entirely sure that this communicative idiom will help us find our way back to reality. My second example is a platform, the TED Talk. The ethos of the TED Talk presents itself as the alternative to someone like Peterson. If the latter is Republican, the world of TED feels much more like the Democratic Party, with its inclusivity of male and female, black and white, etc. It thrives on persuasion rather than assertion. It's richly experiential in its treatment of ideas worth sharing, as it calls them. It models a globalization that appears to be respectful of difference, but there's something about the format that strikes me as phony. The acceptance of the speaker by the crowd, the acceptance of her vulnerable self-disclosure comes cheap. Solidarity is entertainment. Just as the globalization modeled situates itself above and beyond any specific location in what might be an airport lounge or conference center anywhere in the world. And the values expressed, the tolerance embodied, and the diversity so clearly exemplified are always those of Silicon Valley, of the world of technology, entertainment, and design. It's a tightly controlled format, and the only message that can be delivered within it is also tightly controlled, redolent of that intolerant manifestation of political liberalism, which is such a provocative presence on the world stage today. These two that I've looked at so far often masquerade as opposites, the two options on offer in our contemporary world, but they really aren't. So a third communicator I want to bring in is someone I see as a real foil to both of them, Mary Beard. The English historian is a notable communicator, someone who's managed to make ancient history accessible to a modern audience. Politically, she is, as far as one can see, centre-left and a liberal feminist. And yet, she's also a powerful counter-voice to the smooth corporate world of the TED Talk. Her style is not at all monological. I was struck, first of all, when I heard about her habits of communication, by the way she attempted to befriend her trolls on social media, showing a desire to discover that the vitriolic online attacker was in fact a human being who might even want to get close. I'm struck by the way she expresses her femininity and by her freedom to be an older woman who doesn't disguise the effects of the aging process. She has a way of communicating history that foregrounds the reality of the people of the ancient world, bringing out something of that pathos which Barthes found in photography, and which is getting harder and harder for us to access at all. Mary Beard was a pupil of Frank McEachran, who was in turn the inspiration for Alan Bennett's Hector. She's written about McEachran's pedagogy, how his eccentric methods could still have something to teach us today. Learning wasn't all about assessment or curriculum. It was about inculcating a sense of a big world out there, a real world which you could come to know, which you are equipped to understand. Above all, it was learning how to learn that counted, imparting to students the enjoyment, the thrill that comes with learning. Now, I'm not holding Mary Beard up as an exemplar. My intuition is simply that in an age when it's so easy to get drawn into false dichotomies, she illustrates that there are other options available to us than the two which usually dominate the field, other patches of ground on which to stand, which might serve as a surer foundation for the communication of the gospel and for a truly Catholic education. But I said that I wanted to leave you with four communicators, and I now come to the last and most important. He communicates in a way that is yet more foundational, and which none of these other highly skilled communicators can achieve, because he is reality itself. Just look prayerfully at this icon of Christ Pantocrator from St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. Notice the striking difference between the two sides of Christ's face. It's supposed to depict the dual nature of Christ, the humanity and the divinity in one person. It's astonishing to see divinity and humanity united harmoniously in this one being. The incarnation is just this holding of God and of humanity together. As you gaze prayerfully on this one person, notice that he's looking back at you, inviting you into that intimate union. Notice how you are held by his gaze. You can't force your way into this intimacy. You can't initiate yourself into friendship with God. You can only be invited. You cannot stand your ground. You can only be held. Being held by God is the foundation of our Christian journey. It's also the basis for our purchase on truth and reality. It's Jesus holding us that makes us free and keeps us safe. Free because if we are held by him, we can enter openly and fiercely into any dialogue. Safe because he does not let us go unless we cut ourselves off from him. But one with him, we stand in the light of truth. Jesus accompanies us into an encounter with the real, an encounter fraught with danger to our very sense of self, yet charged with the promise of growth and fullness. We seek to set up a relationship. And this is a venture of courage which requires self-confidence, not in terms of being assured that there's something solid inside us, but to be assured that we are related already to something that holds us, engages us, and carries us through. Lord, you hold us, you engage us, you carry us through. Open us to your truth and reality. Help us always to speak and act in a way that helps our brothers and sisters to glimpse the truth of your redeeming love. We make this and all our prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen. So it's my great pleasure now to hand over to Lynn Bourne. I hope she's there. She is. That's very good news indeed. Lynn. Just unmute yourself, Lynn, in the accustomed way. Thank you.
Hey there. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. When we first spoke about today's symposium, I was struck by the authenticity of the argument and the particular relevance of the focus for education today. And the exploration has come at a particularly poignant time for everyone involved in the education world, when terms such as new normal and new reality are frequently heard at the moment. School leaders have been finding ways to keep their school communities connected, even though they were physically dispersed, setting up new ways of communicating with students and their families literally overnight. And this term has brought with it additional challenges, with school and the physicality of classrooms very different indeed from the last time the school communities were there. So our experience in schools over the past 6 months has brought the importance of communication into sharp focus, and the need to be effective in extremely challenging circumstances when we can't rely on tried and tested methods. And Father Damien's early focus on the vital importance of not just what is said, but how it is said, set the foundations particularly strongly for me. And this fascinating exploration of education's relationship with reality that followed chimed with my own experience, both as a pupil and as a teacher, with instances where those boundaries are breached, sticking in my mind in perpetuity. Like, for example, the first time I cleared a bar of underage drinkers simply by turning up, or how small children would point and stare at you in wonder as you pushed your trolley around Sainsbury's on a Saturday morning, marvelling that a teacher needs to actually go shopping. And as a drama specialist, Bennett's The History Boys didn't just launch James Corden's acting career, but spoke to me profoundly as a teacher moving into senior leadership at the time, for the first time objectively and analysing my own philosophy in the classroom and beyond. So igniting possibility and underlining the importance of creativity and a willingness to look beyond accepted boundaries. Your section on the crisis of the real was a fascinating analysis of our fragile hold on reality and the daily examples that heighten our awareness of that fact. The idea that language is a constantly shifting landscape of discourse and the preponderance of image in our culture, where we're so affected by the myriad of shifting images, we're more distanced from reality rather than informed or enriched by them. And it's particularly thought-provoking and relevant to the everyday experience our children and their families have. So how do we cut through that? How do we cut through that imagization of reality, as you said? And the roots of unreality section, where you gave us an in-depth examination of philosophy, which we rarely have the opportunity to consider. And thank you, Father Damien, for the opportunity to immerse ourselves in this detail. And the 4 communicators that you explored, a wide variety of communicative idioms, which will engender different responses, I'm sure, in all of us, from that controversial obfuscation to a vision of globalization that you touched on. The philosophical analysis of communication and communicators resonates with my experience of education, particularly the concept of the big wide world out there, and that we're entrusted with teaching young people how to learn, imparting to them the enjoyment, the thrill that comes with the learning process. This is an overarching responsibility, a fundamental purpose, I believe, for us in Catholic education, which is made possible through our shared foundation that you came to in your conclusion at the end, the ultimate communicator, who holds us, as you said, engages us and carries us through. And the phenomenon is essentially, I think, what sets Catholic schools apart. We all aspire to bring children to the light of Jesus. We all aspire to holding them, engaging them, and carrying them through to the next part of their journey with Christ. So thank you so much, Father Damien, for the opportunity to reflect on these fundamental themes, on the essence of Catholic education. It's not often we have such a rich opportunity. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. And I have to say, I was very grateful for that conversation we had not so long ago about that talk, because I was wondering if it was sort of flying at many thousands of feet above reality, paradoxically. And you kind of gently assured me that actually some of these themes were not only quite relevant in education in general, but particularly the COVID era. Now I'm looking to see if questions are coming in. I can't see any so far. So we might just have to make polite conversation in order to, could you say something, Lynn, come back, she's disappeared now. Could you say something about some of the more abstract stuff I was talking about truth and conspiracy theories, and do you notice that in your school? Is that something that affects young people?
Absolutely. Students will pick up on a nuance in something in social media or something that they've heard that another child at some point during the school day has said to somebody else, and all of a sudden it becomes this enormous truth that they believe, which actually we then have to unpick and bring them back to reality. That is a daily occurrence within the school setting. And when it comes to social media, I believe that, although I wasn't able to be there at some of the presentations this morning, that the threat and the real issues for students' mental health and well-being that are caused by social media is a real problem for us in schools, a real problem.
It's an interesting point to make, isn't it? Because I mean, one can obviously complain about the untruth in social media, but actually the damage it does to mental health is, I think, with young people is in some ways more troubling, more concerning.
Absolutely.
Still no questions coming in. Does anybody in the room have a question that they might like to ask? Because there are real people here, believe it or not.
Oh, are there?
Okay, Anthony is very bravely coming, so I will.
I'd like to pitch to both of you this provocative, or rather ask for your comments, the provocative imagery that, well, argument that Damien's presented. And maybe ask the question of both of you is, do you think that this middle space, the space of non-reality, is actually easier to cope with than the, I don't want to call it hard realism, the challenging realism of life as understood by our not so far away ancestors and forebears, the kind of realism that enabled a generation broken by war to rebuild countries across the West, certainly, and further beyond. Possibly that it was often said of Jesus, he came to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But have you either of you on this, that to some extent the cushioned reality is an easier space to occupy? Sorry if I wasn't looking at the camera, I was concentrating. Could you see that?
Well, thanks for that question. I mean, I'm happy to field it in the first instance, because I think the answer is a very simple yes, because it's a kind of discourse that's geared to ourselves and our preoccupations, the things that trouble us, the things that attract us. And so it's not constrained by a reality that always resists us. That's the difficult thing about reality, is it resists our ego. We'd like things to be one way, and sadly reality doesn't always meet our requirements or fulfill our fantasies. That's what growing up is all about. It's about encountering reality and letting ourselves be shaped by it and in accord with it. And I think that's one of the real challenges today. You can see all sorts of discourses about gender, for example. I brought those in. I hope they weren't too provocative, but I mean, I think they, for the church, trying to communicate a message about that topic is very, very difficult. And I think it's because it's actually not just about that issue. It's about a far deeper issue about what it means to be human, but also what reality is all about. So yes, in some sense, it's a reality that's geared to our egos, and that's extremely comfortable, but it's also unreal, and we know it's unreal, and that nags away at us at some deep level. And I think it generates this consciousness of things being sham, which is extremely unsettling for us. Lynn, did you have
our shared cushioned reality is encroached on by the reality that some students will find themselves in schools. So their experience of the learning process, their experience of school will be fundamentally skewed by their reality that's happening to them, that is impacting on their ability to be able to buy into that cushioned reality. They can't buy into it because there's too much reality happening to them. So that there is, if you understand what I mean, with students who are challenged by whatever reality that's impacting on their lives, they're not able to buy into that cushioned reality. They're not able to be part of it, and then become alienated, which can be a really disruptive influence for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? So it's actually, in a funny way, more vulnerable peoples who can often be more in touch with reality, precisely because it
absolutely
resists them in a way they can't cope with. We have a question. Thank you, Annalise. How is a young person's sense of reality affecting their mental well-being, and how can we support them? That's definitely one for you, Lynn.
It's a very good question. The mental well-being of students is at the top of everybody's lists at the moment. We have increased our access to a professional mental health nurse in one of my schools for that very reason. The students are extremely anxious about the very real situation that they find themselves in schools at the moment, going back into school in such a different way. Nothing's familiar. The way that teachers are behaving isn't the same as it was before. The way that they're able to sit in a classroom isn't the same as it was before. So schools are very much aware of the need for support of mental health. Even local authorities, to be fair, have invested more money in that infrastructure. We're getting information daily on additional infrastructure, not just for students, but also for staff, actually. Mental health, the encroachment of that reality.
Very, very interesting. We keep using the word cushioning, don't we? And there's a little judgment behind that, as though somehow we all ought to toughen up and deal with reality, because it is pretty miserable. And that's why it was quite important, I think, that I tried to end with that image of being held. It's not the being held of the TED Talk, which is not real. It's the image of being held, ultimately by God. But it seems to me a really important part of what we do for our young people is create spaces in which they can be held. Because if we don't have I don't like the expression safe spaces, because it then sounds like something slightly different.
But it is that common understanding, it's that common acceptance of that foundation that has held it together for Catholic schools in this difficult time, actually.
Yeah. I think that's really, really interesting. We've got another question from Louise Phillips. Are the achievement assessment dominated curricula helping or hindering the kind of encounter being talked of by both of you? I think she knows what you're going to say, Lynn.
Yes.
A fairly easy one. I think it is, and that's just because what I alluded to right at the beginning. I mean, any kind of curriculum is it always essentially a kind of distancing from reality, and assessment is always a very artificial process of reduction, particularly when it's opaque as to what is being assessed, which is much less the case these days than was the case when I was at school. You just had no idea what a grade or a mark meant when I was at school, sort of 40 years ago. So it doesn't necessarily have to be bad news if it's, if we've got some way of understanding how to gauge the reality of it, but there's always something artificial about it.
School leaders are clinging on to the hope that this is an opportunity to rethink that culture.
Yeah.
Although I have to say that things that are coming through on a daily basis from the DfE doesn't seem to be supporting that hope. But we are hoping that there will be some movement in terms of that generation of a much more positive culture.
Right. That's interesting. Maria Neal, I know you who you are. The reality that a truth shared at home can be in conflict with a truth shared at school can be an unsettling one for a young child. How do we challenge this whilst valuing the parents as educators? Gosh, that resonates very much with my childhood, and the sense that who do I trust? My family tells me one thing, and then all these teachers are telling me another. Which is true, and the pain of that conflict. Actually, do we talk about that much? I've never reflected.
Well, the bottom line is Catholic schools are in partnership supporting families in the education of those children. So there shouldn't be a situation where a teacher says, no, that's wrong, this is right. There should be a way of exploring different points of view and different realities, I guess.
Okay, that's a good. So it's a really. I haven't thought that one through enough to give a well chiseled answer. But we already have another question, so thanks for that, Maria. And we'll have a cup of coffee sometime and talk that one over. From Richard Smith, how do we ensure the authentic truth of Christ when students are disrupted by the media? That's a nice, easy one. I mean, I don't think we always can. I think we have to be realistic about this. There's a pretty unequal struggle going on between different sources of authority here, and the church is often in an extremely weak situation. But there are moments when one can break through, because I was very struck listening to those three young adults talking earlier about their faith and the way they were. The word that kept coming through was authentic, and it just seems to me that to be authentic, to be who you are, to tell the truth as you know it, not to try to pretend to do more than that. That's about the only thing I think we can offer, and God just has to provide the circumstances and the inspiration, I think, sometimes for us to take on the media, but it can feel like a losing battle sometimes.
But we also have responsibility to provide consistency, a consistent foundation for them to be able to build on, so that they always have something to go back to, and it's the same consistent foundation.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So authenticity and consistency. Very good. How do we bring young people to true self-actualization with the challenge of brokenness and detachment? That's Richard Smith again. Gosh, that's another demanding, difficult question. True self-actualization somehow must integrate brokenness. It integrates who we are, doesn't it? There is this sort of Superman model on offer, which we all know is a real betrayal of the depths of humanity, and it's the very core of the gospel that Jesus is a crucified Lord, crucified and risen. You don't factor out the crucifixion without doing the most appalling violence to the gospel. Violence that is often meted out to the gospel today in the various forms of the prosperity gospel, in its Catholic and Protestant form. So it is a really important issue, that.
And providing young people with the tools to be able to deal with that brokenness.
Right. Say a bit more.
Well, if broken doesn't mean broken forever. Broken means the opportunity to rebuild, and they need to have the tools and the confidence, and again that foundation, to be able to start again, or to go in a different direction, or to mend that brokenness.
So something about hope.
Absolutely.
I think a word I didn't use, but probably I ought to have done, and is I think right at the heart of what I was talking about. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for the questions. They've been wonderful and helpful. I notice, as they say on that television, on that radio show, that the time is coming to an end. And so I'm going to hand over to Anthony, who's going to, I think, bring this whole wonderful and rich experience of Encounter to an end.
As you get older, of course, it seems like yesterday when Pope Benedict was here. under this banner, Heart Speaks to Heart. And our symposium has tried to explore ways in which, far from being superficial, we could enter into a dialogue, which was the, if you like, leitmotif of the whole visit of Pope Benedict, to enter into that dialogue that is the opposite of superficial, that transformative dialogue which moves our hearts to be more authentic, truer to ourselves, but also truer and more alert to the needs of our fellow human beings. And I think that exploring today, as we have done, first of all with Christopher and Rudy, how media, how the medium of the message, how the way in which we communicate today conditions that, facilitates that, gives us opportunities, I think was entirely appropriate. Secondly, I think the idea of understanding mission, how mission might be part of that picture, Karen led us in through research into young adults, and the way in which discipleship, for want of a better word, comes about, was almost given exemplification, I think, by, I'm going to get the wrong way around, Lucas, Becky and Erin. I think Erin's name appeared, and then the others two were there with Erin up there in Birmingham. Given voice really by their encounter with Christ, their encounter with church, their creative encounter with each other, and the challenge to speak of faith in this generation. And then last but not least, I think that the way in which Damien has explored this, raised a flag that sounded an alarm, as it were, that we could be slipping into a kind of an unreal world, which is content somehow to be apart from, to distance itself from the authenticity that we were all searching. And as Lynn's, I don't know whether Lynn consoled me or confirmed Damien's concerns, that this is a task for Catholic education, that somehow, and St. Mary's is founded for the purpose of Catholic education, and unless we get our self-understanding aligned properly, that unless it's that our self-understanding is one of belonging to God, to living God, and to flourishing God, that somehow, if that task of an anthropology of hope is not something that we communicate in a place like St. Mary's or in the grand scheme of Catholic education, then to some extent we're letting down the great inheritance we have from our forebears, who, and so many who have given their lives to Catholic education and to the flourishing of young people in our country and beyond. So I think that this group that has been gathered by Simon Utley, he's been the recruitment officer for this symposium. I'd like to personally thank Simon. I'd like to thank all those involved in the logistics of the day, particularly Louise Phillips from conferencing, and Jasmine from IT support, and to Annalise Gordon, head of the Institute of Education, and all my colleagues here at the Aquinas Centre here at St. Mary's for their work in supporting and promoting this event. Thank, last of all of you participated online. We had an image when we first planned this event that you'd all be here. We'd be giving you cups of tea, nice sandwiches, and you'd be able to walk around these beautiful gardens here at Strawberry Hill, and we'd all be together and having the exchanges that conference delegates can. I'd love to think that we could carry on this conversation. These talks will be on the website. We'll try and put a facility for exchange and discourse to continue on. And we hope that this will be the first of a series of symposia that we will run, to which you are warmly invited, and we look forward to facilitating in the coming months. Thanks again to all our speakers. Thanks to all of you. Next up from St. Mary's, if you're interested, it is my best RE lesson, starting at 4:30. Whether your experience of RE was for good or for ill, at 4:30, we're going to be seeing some RE teachers on fire. God bless. Goodbye.